At 7:35 hours on June 6, 1944, Company Sergeant Major Charles Martin of the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada crouched inside a landing craft cutting through rough waves toward Berniers-sur-Mer. Only 25 years old, the boy from Cooksville, Ontario, stared ahead at the strip of coastline that intelligence reports said would be a death trap. The wind smelled of salt and oil, and the dull thunder of naval guns rolled across the channel. Martin knew what waited beyond the surf: machine guns, mines, and fire. That morning, 14,000 Canadian soldiers were set to assault Juno Beach, one of the 5 Allied landing zones of Operation Overlord. The planners in London had not expected them to succeed. Behind the polished language of briefing papers and war room reports lay a simple judgment. The Canadians were enthusiastic amateurs, brave perhaps, but not hardened soldiers. British officers called them colonials. American generals barely noticed them in the crowded invasion meetings. Yet, in a few hours, those same Canadians would prove every skeptic wrong. The road to Dida Martin had joined the Queen's Own Rifles in June 1940, when the regiment first mobilized for war. For 4 years he trained in England, endless drills in the rain, exercises through mud, long nights studying field manuals by lantern light. He rose from rifleman to company sergeant major, one of the youngest in the regiment's history. Now, at 25, he carried the weight of 100 men's lives and the hopes of a nation that had waited years to show what it could do. The men around him were ordinary Canadians, farmers, factory workers, mechanics, and shop clerks, most of them in their early 20s. They had trained for combat but had never seen it. Their boots were new to blood and sand. The name Dieppe hung over them like a ghost. 2 years earlier, in August 1942, the Dieppe raid had ended in disaster. In just 9 hours, more than 3,000 Canadians were killed or captured on the rocky beaches of France. To the men in the landing craft, Dieppe was more than a memory. It was a warning. Every one of them had heard stories of that slaughter and swore not to repeat it. The German defences ahead, designated Weiterstandsnest 27, a strongpoint built into Berniers, were formidable. The 716th Infantry Division of the Wehrmacht had spent 3 years fortifying the coast. Concrete bunkers and 75mm guns commanded overlapping fields of fire. Machine gun nests, barbed wire, and mines lined the beaches. Military doctrine stated that an attacking force needed a 3-to-1 advantage to overcome such defenses. The Canadians did not have that advantage. Naval bombardment had begun hours earlier, but it was brief. When the guns fell silent, the smoke drifted away and the beach lay strangely untouched. Later intelligence showed that only 14% of the fortifications had actually been destroyed. As the landing craft bounced in the waves, Martin realized that the enemy would be waiting, alive and ready. Skeptics and commanders. The assault on Juno Beach had been approved by General Dwight D. Eisenhower on February 12, 1944. He knew Juno, lying between the British Gold and Sword beaches, was one of the most heavily defended sections of Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, inspecting the Third Canadian Infantry Division in March, had privately doubted whether they could handle such a task. His report to headquarters praised their spirit and enthusiasm, but questioned their readiness for combat. Yet, someone had to take Juno, and Montgomery decided the Canadians would do it. The division's commander, Major General Rodney Keller, was a veteran of the Royal Military College and the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. He had served in the army since 1920, and under his leadership were soldiers from every Canadian province. They had trained for years in England, waiting for a chance that never seemed to come. Their problem was not lack of preparation but lack of respect. Within the Allied hierarchy, Canada was Britain's junior partner, allowed to contribute, but not trusted to lead. The Canadians knew this. It burned inside them as they crossed the English Channel on the night of June 5. The longest day begins. The first casualties came even before the beach was in sight. German artillery shells and mines struck landing craft, tearing them apart. The sea caught fire with oil and burning men. Of the vessels approaching Juno, roughly 30% were damaged or destroyed. Those who survived faced enfilading fire from positions designed to sweep the sand horizontally. When the ramp of Martin's craft dropped at 7:55 hours, the world exploded into noise. Machine gun fire hammered the air, bullets slicing through the surf. He later wrote that the bombardment had done no visible damage. The bunkers stood intact. Soldiers jumped into waist-deep water, clutching rifles over their heads, wading forward through waves that hid mines and obstacles. Men were cut down in groups. The sea turned red. By 9 o'clock, the Canadians had suffered catastrophic losses, but they did not retreat. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles lost half their men within 10 minutes of landing. The Queen's Own Rifles suffered 143 casualties that morning, the highest of any Canadian battalion. The North Shore Regiment from New Brunswick took 125, and the Regina Rifles lost 108. Still, they kept advancing. Each small victory, a few meters of sand, a destroyed gun position, was bought with lives. Learning from Dieppe that Germans believed the attack would fail just as Dieppe had. General Wilhelm Richter, commanding the 716th Division, had orders to hold the beach at all costs. He expected the Canadians to break under fire. What he did not realize was that they had spent 2 years preparing for this exact moment. Every mistake at Dieppe had been studied in painful detail. The Canadians had trained with amphibious tanks, engineer detachments, and combined arms coordination until every movement was instinct. They had turned failure into doctrine. At approximately 9:15, Martin led his company through a blasted gap in the seawall. Ahead loomed a concrete pillbox, spitting machine gun fire down the main street. Martin's men threw grenades, then rushed forward under covering fire. The explosion silenced the gun. They stormed the position, cleared it, and pressed into Bernières-sur-Mer. The battle turned into a brutal house-to-house fight. German defenders fired from windows and doorways. The Canadians adapted quickly, blowing holes through interior walls, a tactic that would later be called moutholing, to move unseen from building to building. It was slow, methodical, and savage work. By 10 o'clock, the Queen's Own Rifles had secured the eastern section of Bernières, turning the tide to the west. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles and Regina Rifle Regiment were locked in similar struggles at Courcelles, where the Soul's River divided the town into 2 fortified halves. Tanks from the 1st Hussars and Fort Garry Horse Regiments supported the infantry, their guns blasting bunkers at point-blank range. Despite the chaos, coordination held. By 11 o'clock, Canadian units had cleared the strongpoints and were pushing inland, far ahead of schedule. The success shocked Allied planners. They had expected the beach fighting to last all day, perhaps longer. Montgomery's orders had limited the Canadians' goal to securing the beach and nearby towns. Instead, they were already miles inland. The 9th Canadian Infantry Brigade, held in reserve, landed at 11:40 and immediately began advancing under Brigadier Douglas Cunningham. The North Nova Scotia Highlanders and Burke Fusiliers formed a column and drove south, toward Brett, bypassing resistance where possible. The speed of the advance created a new problem. The 21st Panzer Division, stationed south of Cannes, had been ordered to counterattack the beaches. Expecting to find the invaders pinned on the sand, they instead found Canadians already 8 to 12 kilometers inland, the deepest Allied penetration anywhere on DAD. Against the odds by 13 o'clock hours, elements of the Sherbrooke Fusiliers had reached the main road between Cannes and Bayeux, the day's ultimate objective. Planners had assumed it would take until nightfall to get that far. The Canadians did it by early afternoon. It was more than a tactical success, it was a statement. For the first time in the war, a Canadian formation had not only met expectations, but exceeded them dramatically. The Germans counterattacked at 16 o'clock. Exploiting a gap between the Canadians and British forces landing at Sword Beach, General Edgar Feuchtinger's 21st Panzer Division, with 75 tanks, struck hard. The Canadians and British fought with limited anti-tank weapons, holding the line through 4 hours of desperate combat. At 20 o'clock, a vast formation of Allied gliders crossed overhead, carrying reinforcements for the British 6th Airborne Division. The sight convinced Feuchtinger that Allied air power was overwhelming. He ordered his forces to withdraw. By nightfall, the beachhead was secure. The Canadians had achieved every objective, captured for coastal towns, advanced farther inland than any other Allied division, and linked up with British units on both flanks. The cost was steep: 340 Canadians killed, 574 wounded, and 47 captured. But the victory was complete. Historian John Keegan later wrote that by the end of June 6, the Canadians stood deeper into France than any other Allied force. Recognition and in the aftermath, the German army took notice. Intelligence reports from June 7 described the Canadian advance as unexpectedly aggressive and professionally executed. Officers who had dismissed them as colonials revised their opinions overnight. Reports from the 716th Division praised Canadian small unit tactics, coordination with armor, and battlefield adaptability. One German officer remarked that the Canadians fought with a ferocity not seen since the Eastern Front. Allied acknowledgement was slower. Montgomery officially praised the division, but privately admitted surprise at their success. American generals were preoccupied with their own struggles at Omaha and Utah. The Canadians' achievements at Juno were largely overshadowed, a pattern that would repeat throughout the war. Still, among those who fought that day, there was no doubt the Canadians had done the impossible. The lessons of Italy before D-Day. The Canadians had already proven themselves in another theatre, the Italian campaign. The 1st Canadian Infantry Division and 1st Canadian Armoured Brigade had landed in Sicily on July 10, 1943. During Operation Husky, initial opposition came mostly from demoralized Italian troops who surrendered quickly, but the advance soon turned into a brutal fight against retreating German forces who used the island's mountains as natural fortresses during in searing heat. Canadian units fought through towns like Leonforte and Argyra, enduring fierce resistance. The battle for Leonforte lasted 3 days of close combat before the loyal Edmonton Regiment captured the town. At Argyra, coordinated assaults, supported by artillery, finally broke the German line. By August 7th, after 4 weeks of continuous fighting, Axis forces evacuated Sicily. The Canadians had learned invaluable lessons: how to combine infantry, armor, and artillery under fire, how to maneuver through mountains, and how to sustain morale under punishing conditions. When they crossed to mainland Italy on September 3, 1943, they faced an even grimmer campaign. Rivers, ridges, and fortified lines slowed every advance. The crossing of the Moro River in December cost 1,400 casualties. The Germans held the high ground and poured fire into the narrow valley. Engineers built bridges under constant shelling, while infantry advanced across open fields. Then came Ortona, a medieval town on cliffs above the Adriatic. It was defended by the 1st Parachute Division, among Germany's elite. Streets were too narrow for tanks to maneuver, and the buildings had been turned into fortresses. From December 20th to 28th, 1943, Canadian forces fought in what historians would call Canada's Stalingrad. Buildings were mined, booby-trapped, and fought over room by room. The loyal Edmonton Regiment and Seaforth Highlanders learned to advance by blowing holes through walls, mouse-holing, to avoid sniper fire in the streets. Tanks fired point-blank into upper floors to clear defenders. There was no ceasefire for Christmas. The fighting raged through the holiday until the Germans finally withdrew on December 28th. The price was high. Minus 1,375 Canadian dead in the Moro and Ortona battles, but the victory was decisive. The Germans, who had expected to hold indefinitely, were forced to retreat. One German officer later wrote that Canadian troops fought with a skill and aggression that rivaled the Russians. The world began to notice the Canadians were no longer inexperienced colonials breaking the Gustav Line by May 1944. Canadian forces were seasoned veterans. The 1st Canadian Corps, now consisting of both 1st Infantry and 5th Armoured Divisions, participated in the offensive against the Gustav Line and the capture of Rome. Fighting in the Liri Valley, Canadian troops crossed open ground under relentless fire, supported by hundreds of artillery pieces. They breached the Hitler Line, a key German defensive belt, on May 23 and advanced toward Rome. When the city was liberated on June 4, 1944, Canadian soldiers marched through its streets just 2 days before the Normandy landings. The Italian campaign cost Canada over 25,000 casualties, including 5,800 killed, yet it forged the army that would later storm Juno Beach. Officers who commanded in Normandy, men like Guy Simons and Christopher Vokes, learned their craft in Italy. Soldiers who arrived as green recruits left as hardened veterans. The experience transformed the Canadian Army from a training force into a professional, combat-tested organization, a force transformed by the time they crossed the Channel for D-Day. The Canadians were no longer the hesitant troops of 1940. They were disciplined, innovative, and ready. The memory of Dieppe haunted them, but it also drove them. Every soldier who stepped onto Juno carried the burden of that failure and the determination to redeem it. When the day was over, they had not only succeeded, they had outperformed every other Allied division on the beaches of Normandy. from the shattered seawalls of Bernières-sur-Mer to the streets of Ortona, from the muddy rivers of Italy to the wheat fields of France, the Canadians had become what no one expected, a first-rate army forged in the crucible of war. The Canadians' success on Juno Beach had stunned the Allied command. By nightfall on June 6, 1944, they had penetrated farther inland than any other division on D-Day, nearly 12 kilometers. Yet victory on the beach was only the beginning. Ahead lay the dense hedgerows, villages, and fields surrounding the city of Caen, a strategic crossroads that controlled movement across northern France. The battle for Caen would test the Canadians in ways D-Day had not, transforming them from an underestimated force into one of the most respected formations in the Allied armies. Holding the beachhead in the days following D-Day, Canadian and British divisions expanded their positions, linking together the beachheads of Gold, Juno, and Sword. Supply ships arrived hourly, unloading fuel, ammunition, and vehicles. Engineers worked under sniper fire to clear mines and build makeshift harbors. By June 9th, the Third Canadian Infantry Division had established a solid defensive perimeter and was pushing inland toward Carpoquet Airfield, a key objective west of Caen. The Germans were determined to hold the city. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel considered Caen the anchor of the entire Atlantic defense line. Without it, his forces in Normandy could not maneuver or coordinate. German divisions, including the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, and elements of the 21st Panzer Division, concentrated around the city. These were no ordinary soldiers. Many were veterans of the Eastern Front. The 12th SS Division, composed largely of fanatic teenage volunteers indoctrinated in Nazi ideology, fought with reckless courage and brutality. On June 7th, they counterattacked the Canadian advance near the villages of Arthy and Burren. North Nova Scotia Highlanders and the Fusiliers found themselves facing tanks and infantry, advancing from multiple directions. For hours, the Canadians fought to hold their ground. German armor surged through hedgerows, firing at point-blank range. The Canadians destroyed several tanks but were gradually forced back. When the smoke cleared, 128 Canadians were dead, 89 wounded, and dozens taken prisoner. The prisoners' fate was grim. At Abbey Darden, a medieval monastery turned German headquarters, SS troops executed 20 Canadian soldiers. Similar atrocities occurred elsewhere along the front. These murders enraged Canadian troops and hardened their resolve. From that day on, they understood the kind of enemy they faced, one that offered no mercy and deserved none in return. The battle for Carpoquet, June. The fight for Caen dragged on. The Allies launched a series of offensives, Operations Perch, Epsom, and Windsor, to capture the city's western approaches. The Canadians bore much of the burden. On July 4th, during Operation Windsor, the Royal Winnipeg Rifles and Regina Rifles, supported by Fort Garry horse tanks, assaulted Carpoquet Airfield. It was a heavily fortified position defended by elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division. At 5 o'clock hours, artillery thundered across the fields, and the infantry moved out. German machine guns opened instantly, cutting through the ranks. Every hangar, every building, every meter of runway became a battleground. Tanks fired directly into enemy positions, while mortar rained down. The Canadians advanced under sheets of tracer fire, their movements choreographed through smoke and chaos. By evening, they controlled most of the airfield, but the adjacent village of Carpoquet itself remained in German hands. The fight continued through July 5th. German counterattacks, supported by tanks and self-propelled guns, tried to retake the airfield, but the Canadians held firm. When the Germans finally withdrew on July 6th, Carpoquet was theirs, at a cost of over 400 casualties. It was a costly but vital step toward the capture of Caen, Operation Charnwood, and the fall of Caen 2 days later. The Canadians prepared for Operation Charnwood, the massive offensive. The Canadians used the same mouse-holing tactics perfected at Ortona, blasting through walls rather than exposing themselves in open streets. House by house, the Canadians pushed forward. The fighting lasted 3 days. By July 9th, they controlled northern Caen. The Germans withdrew across the Orne River, leaving the city in ruins. It was a bittersweet victory, a shattered landscape of dust and corpses, yet it marked a turning point. The Canadians had defeated one of Germany's elite divisions in a direct urban battle. Simons, the relentless innovator. In the aftermath of Caen, the spotlight turned to Lieutenant General Guy Simonds, a commander whose intellect and audacity would define the next phase of the campaign. Born in 1903, educated at the Royal Military College and Britain's Staff College, Camberley Simons was analytical, disciplined, and ruthlessly efficient. He had little patience for mediocrity and expected total precision from subordinates. Montgomery considered him one of the most promising corps commanders in the Allied armies. Simons believed in innovation. Born of necessity, he had seen the blood cost of daylight attacks against prepared defenses and knew they could not afford to repeat that mistake. As the Allies prepared for their breakout from Normandy, he began developing new tactics, methods that would combine shock, deception, and speed to penetrate German lines. Operation Totalize, Night of Fire. By early August, the Allied advance had stalled. Caen was in ruins, but German forces still blocked the road south toward Falaise. Montgomery ordered Simon's 2nd Canadian Corps to lead the breakthrough. The operation would be called Totalize, and it would change the course of the war in France. Simon's plan was revolutionary. Instead of a daytime frontal assault, he proposed a night attack, something few armies had ever attempted with armor. To achieve this, he equipped tanks and vehicles with radio beacons and tracer guides to maintain formation in darkness. Pathfinder tanks led the columns, their lights shielded to create narrow beams marking the route. Infantry would ride forward in converted armored carriers, made from stripped-down self-propelled guns, offering more protection than open trucks. At 23:30 hours, on August 7, 1944, 800 Canadian and Polish tanks and vehicles moved silently into the night. Supported by waves of bombers that had turned the German front line into a furnace, the assault achieved complete surprise. German gunners, blinded by darkness and smoke, could not find their targets. The Canadians smashed through the first line of defenses, reaching their objectives by dawn. In 12 hours, they had advanced 7 kilometers, deeper than any previous Allied offensive in Normandy. For a moment, victory seemed complete. Then, as daylight came, German reserves, including the feared Tiger tanks of the 1st SS Panzer Corps. For 3 days, the fields south of Caen became a hell of tank battles and artillery fire. The Canadians and Poles held firm. When the smoke cleared, hundreds of German vehicles lay burning across the countryside. Totalize had broken the back of German resistance. Operation Tractable and the closing of the Falaise Gapsamins struck again a week later with Operation Tractable. Launched on August 14, its goal was to trap the retreating German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army near the town of Falaise. Learning from WWII, Simons ordered the attack to begin under a massive smokescreen that concealed Canadian and Polish movements. Heavy bombers pounded German rear areas while artillery unleashed a continuous barrage. The 1st Canadian Army, commanded by General Harry Var, advanced from the north while American forces under General Omar Bradley moved from the south. The goal was to close the encirclement, the Falaise pocket. Canadian and Polish armored divisions attacked relentlessly, despite fierce counterattacks by trapped German units desperate to escape. Villages changed hands multiple times. The air stank of fuel, dust, and death. By August 16, the Canadians reached the outskirts of Falaise. The pocket was closing. Tens of thousands of German soldiers crowded into a shrinking corridor between Chembois and Troon, bombed from above and shelled from all sides. Some historians later argued the Allies should have closed the gap faster, but those on the ground knew the truth. The Canadians and Poles were fighting non-stop, often surrounded, in chaos beyond imagination. On August 20th, the Falaise Gap finally slammed shut. Between 50,000 and 100,000 German troops were killed, wounded, or captured. The once formidable German presence in Normandy ceased to exist. The victory at Falaise was the decisive end of the Normandy campaign. Without it, the German army might have reformed new defensive lines and prolonged the war for months. The march to Antwerp. By the end of August 1944, the Canadian First Army was operating as a full, independent formation under Crerar, the largest force ever commanded by a Canadian officer in battle. Their next task would be one of the hardest of the war, clearing the approaches to the Belgian port of Antwerp. The port had fallen into Allied hands intact in early September, captured by British forces, but the Scheldt Estuary, the 80-kilometer-long waterway leading from the North Sea to the port, remained under German control. Without it, Antwerp was useless. Montgomery assigned the job to the Canadians, calling it necessary but unpleasant work. He was right on both counts. The terrain was miserable, flat, flooded lowlands, crisscrossed with dikes, canals, and mud. The Germans, under General Gustav von Zangen, had flooded large areas deliberately and built strong defensive positions. The Battle of the Scheldt would become the most grueling campaign Canadian soldiers ever fought. The Breskin's Pocket. The first phase began on October 2, 1944, when the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division attacked the Breskin's Pocket, south of the estuary. Amphibious vehicles known as buffaloes carried the infantry across flooded inlets under withering fire. Each landing was a small DA. The Canadians advanced slowly through waterlogged fields, every village defended by machine guns and artillery. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. On October 13th, a day that would be remembered with sorrow, the Black Watch Regiment of Montreal attacked the village of Hoogerheide, near Ortona. The Germans, including paratroopers of the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, were dug in. The Canadians advanced across open ground, swept by fire. When the attack ended, 145 men were casualties, 56 killed, 27 captured, the rest wounded. It was one of the regiment's darkest days. Survivors called it Black Friday. Despite the losses, the Canadians kept going. By late October, they had cleared the Breskin's Pocket and were moving onto the South Beveland Peninsula. The final and most difficult objective lay ahead, Walcheren Island, which controlled the mouth of the Scheldt. The battle for Walcheren Island. Walcheren was heavily fortified, its defenses designed to protect Antwerp's approaches. The only land connection was a narrow causeway from South Beveland, a 40-meter-wide strip of road, elevated above flooded fields with no cover. German forces could fire down its entire length. Attacking it seemed suicidal, but it had to be done. Between October 31st and November 2nd, Canadian troops assaulted the causeway again and again. The Calgary Highlanders led several attacks, suffering heavy losses. Men advanced through smoke and shrapnel, clinging to the road's edges, while machine guns swept them from both sides. The causeway became a killing ground, but the assaults drew German attention away from the main landings. On November 5th, British commandos and Canadian units launched amphibious assaults on the western beaches of Walcheren, supported by naval guns and rocket ships. The coordination was perfect. By November 8th, the Germans, realizing they were surrounded, surrendered. The Battle of the Scheldt was over. Victory and costly operation lasted 5 weeks. The 1st Canadian Army, including British and Polish units, suffered 12,873 casualties, of which 6,367 were Canadian. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division alone lost 3,650 men in just over a month. Yet the mission was a complete success. On November 28, 1944, the first Allied convoy sailed up the Scheldt into Antwerp, led by the Canadian-built freighter Fort Cataraqui. The port immediately became the main supply hub for the Allied armies advancing into Germany. Without Antwerp, the winter campaign of 1944–45 would have stalled completely. Historians later called the Scheldt campaign one of the most critical and least celebrated battles of the Western Front. American historian Charles B. MacDonald wrote that it demonstrated the Canadian Army's ability to plan and execute complex, multi-phased operations under the worst possible conditions. British historian Terry Kopp described it as one of the most grueling and significant battles ever fought by Canadian forces. It was the battle that cemented the Canadians' reputation as professionals. Recognition earned by the winter of 1944. The 1st Canadian Army was acknowledged as one of the premier formations in the Allied order of battle. From Juno Beach to the Scheldt, they had overcome skepticism, prejudice, and terrain that would have defeated lesser troops. Their reward was not rest, but another challenge, the liberation of the Netherlands and the final march into Germany. The guns fell silent over Walcheren Island on November 8, 1944. The Battle of the Scheldt had ended. After 5 weeks of relentless combat through mud, flooding, and fire, it was a hard-won victory, one that unlocked Antwerp, the great port whose capture transformed Allied logistics. Without the Scheldt, the armies of Eisenhower and Montgomery might have starved in Belgium's winter. With it, the road to Germany stood open. The Canadians had done what few thought possible. They had cleared the most difficult terrain in Western Europe, defeated veteran German forces, and achieved one of the most strategically significant victories of the war. But the price had been staggering. 12,873 casualties, including 6,367 Canadians, for the exhausted soldiers of 1st Canadian Army. The The winter of 1944–45 would bring only a brief pause before new orders sent them toward their final and greatest test, the liberation of the Netherlands and the crossing of the Rhine River into Germany itself. Winter on the Moss. After the Scheldt, the Canadians held defensive positions along the Maas River, stretching from Nijmegen to Venlo for 3 long months. November, December, and January they endured cold, rain, and exhaustion. The land was waterlogged, foxholes filled overnight, rations were scarce. Some battalions that had stormed Juno Beach and fought across France were reduced to half strength. It was a hard winter for the Dutch civilians. The occupying Germans had flooded large areas and cut food supplies to punish a railway strike by Dutch workers. The result was the Hunger Winter, one of the worst famines in Western Europe's modern history. Millions faced starvation, surviving on tulip bulbs and turnips. In the cities, thousands froze to death in unheated houses. The Canadian soldiers, bivouacked in barns and flooded trenches, could hear the desperate pleas of civilians across the river. Many shared their rations or smuggled supplies through the lines. They would remember those faces when the time came to liberate the Netherlands. Preparing for the Rhineland offensive by early 1945, General Harry Crerar,'s 1st Canadian Army was once again on the move. Reinforced with British and Polish divisions, it had become the largest army ever commanded by a Canadian. Its next task was part of Operation Veritable, the Allied offensive designed to crush German defenses between the Rhine and Maas rivers, the final barrier to the German heartland. The operation began on February 8, 1945. Under appalling conditions, rain turned the ground into a swamp, and the Germans had flooded lowlands to slow the attack. Still, the Canadians advanced. Lieutenant General Guy Simons, commanding 2nd Canadian Corps, led the assault from the Nijmegen salient, pushing southeast through the Reichswald forest. The fighting was slow and brutal. Every village was mined, every road lined with artillery. American forces attacking from the south faced similar conditions, their progress hampered by mud and relentless resistance. Eisenhower later wrote to calling the Canadians' progress a testament to skill, determination, and valor under conditions more difficult than any other assault of the war. After 3 weeks of grinding combat, the Germans broke. The Reichswald forest was cleared, and Canadian units reached the banks of the Rhine by early March. It was the last natural barrier before the heart of Germany, crossing the Rhine. Operation Plunder on March 23, 1945. The Allies launched Operation Plunder, the massive crossing of the Rhine River. It was one of the largest coordinated assaults of the war, involving British, American, and Canadian forces. The Canadians' role was critical. Their engineers would build the Bailey bridges, pontoon crossings, and floating causeways that would carry the entire Allied army across the river, under constant German shelling. Canadian engineers worked through the night, anchoring pontoons and laying steel spans across the fast-moving river. They labored in freezing water, often waist-deep, using searchlights and tracer fire for illumination. By dawn, the bridges were complete. Allied tanks began to roll across, their treads clanging on steel as they advanced into Germany. By the end of March, Emmerich, a key town on the Rhine's right bank, fell to the Canadians. Behind them, an endless column of vehicles and men streamed eastward. The river that Hitler had vowed would never be crossed had been conquered, and Canadian ingenuity had made it possible. The liberation of the Netherlands begins with the Rhine behind them. The Canadians faced 2 new missions. First, clear northern Germany up to the Weser River. Second, liberate the western Netherlands, where millions of civilians were still trapped under German occupation and near starvation. The 1st Canadian Corps, under Major General Charles Foulkes, was assigned the Dutch operation. The 2nd Canadian Corps, under turned east toward Emden, Oldenburg, and the North Sea coast, where remnants of the German army still fought. In early April 1945, the liberation of the Netherlands began. The Canadians advanced across rivers, canals, and dikes, fighting a series of difficult battles through towns and farmlands. Battle for Groningen, fought between April 13th and 16th, became one of the fiercest urban engagements of the campaign. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division attacked from the south, entering the city's outskirts under heavy artillery fire. German defenders, regular Wehrmacht troops, mixed with SS units, fought from every house and street corner. Snipers hid in church towers. Machine guns raked the canals. The Canadians used the tactics they had perfected in Italy and Normandy. mouse-holding, grenades, and close coordination with armor. Wasp flamethrower carriers blasted bunkers at close range. For 4 days, fighting raged block by block. Civilians huddled in cellars while buildings burned above them. Finally, on April 16th, the last German strongpoint surrendered. Groningen was free. The city's residents poured into the streets, cheering, waving flags that had been hidden since 1940. Children climbed onto tanks, and women handed flowers to the soldiers. For the first time in months, there was hope. Arnhem, the city of Gosweiler. The Second Corps advanced north. The 1st Canadian Corps moved west, toward Arnhem, the city that had haunted Allied memory since Operation Market Garden. In September 1944, British paratroopers had been dropped near Arnhem in an ambitious plan to seize the Rhine bridges. The operation ended in catastrophe. Most of the 1st Airborne Division was wiped out, and Arnhem remained under German control. Now, in April 1945, the Canadians would finish what the British had begun. Between April 12th and 16th, the 5th Canadian Armoured Division, supported by the 49th British Infantry Division, attacked the city. Engineers constructed bridges under fire across the Eidsel and Nederrijn rivers, while artillery laid thick smoke screens to hide the crossings. The Germans fought stubbornly, but the Canadians were relentless. By April 16th, Arnhem was liberated, a symbolic victory that restored the honor of Market Garden and opened the road to Western Holland, a delicate advance in the densely populated Western Netherlands, home to Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and The Hague. The Canadians faced a grim dilemma. Millions of civilians were starving, but German troops still occupied the cities. Using artillery or airstrikes could save soldiers' lives, but risk the lives of thousands of Dutch civilians. The Canadian commanders made a moral choice. They would advance carefully, using infantry tactics rather than heavy bombardment, even if it meant higher casualties for themselves. On April 17th, Canadian troops entered Apeldoorn, liberating the town after days of hard fighting. Among the citizens freed was a 7-year-old girl named Elizabeth Lisbcaf. A unit of the Royal Canadian Corps of Signals adopted her as an honorary captain, sewing rank insignia onto her blue sweater. She wore it every day for years, a small symbol of the bond between Canadians and the Dutch that would endure for generations. By April 21st, Canadian forces reached the North Sea coast, capturing Zeevoorde, Leiden and Leuven. The advance across the northern Netherlands was almost complete, but the humanitarian crisis in the western provinces grew worse by the day. Operation Manna and Chowhound. Recognizing the desperate situation, Canadian and German commanders arranged a temporary truce on April 28, allowing food supplies to reach the starving civilians behind German lines. The Canadians, in coordination with the Royal Air Force and the U.S. Army Air Forces, organized Operation Manna and Operation Chowhound. Massive airdrops of food over occupied territory. From the first flights onward, Dutch civilians flooded the fields beneath the bombers, waving white sheets as the planes roared overhead. Lancasters, Halifaxes, and B-17 flying fortresses dropped sacks of flour, canned goods, and chocolate bars from low altitude. In some places, the Germans even helped distribute the food. These missions saved tens of thousands of lives in the final days before the war's end. The surrender at Wageningen, May 4, 1945. Canadian troops received a message from headquarters, all offensive operations to cease at 0800 hours. May 5, Germany had agreed to surrender its forces in the Netherlands. 2 days later, on May 7, the unconditional surrender of all German forces in Europe was signed in Reims. The official ceremony in the Netherlands took place at the Hotel de Wereld in Wageningen. Lieutenant General Charles Falks, commander of the 1st Canadian Corps, accepted the surrender of General Johannes Bloskowitz, commander of the German forces in the Netherlands. Present at the meeting was Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, representing the Dutch government in exile when the papers were signed. Falks simply said, "It's over." For the Canadians, it was the end of nearly 5 years of continuous combat from Sicily to the Scheldt, from Juno to Groningen, the sweetest springing towns and villages across the Netherlands. Liberation became joy unbounded. Streets filled with music and flowers. Civilians climbed onto Sherman tanks, handing out tulips and hugs. Children rode on armored vehicles. Women embraced soldiers. Church bells rang for the first time in years. Dutch photographers called it the sweetest spring. The gratitude of the Dutch people was overwhelming. They had endured 5 years of occupation, hunger, and terror. Now, the men who freed them were kind, disciplined, and generous. Canadian soldiers shared rations, gave away chocolate, and helped rebuild schools and hospitals. Unlike some other armies, the Canadians treated civilians with respect. This compassion created a bond that would last for generations. Over 7,600 Canadians were killed in the Netherlands between September 1944 and May 1945, many in the final weeks, when victory was already certain. Some died just days before the surrender. Private Harry Broad, of the Canadian Grenadier Guards, was killed by artillery in Apeldoorn on April 15th. The same shell that destroyed the house of a Dutch woman named Nelly van den Berg after the war. Nelly wrote to Harry's widow, describing his final moments and thanking her for his sacrifice. Stories like theirs multiplied personal connections, linking to nations through shared grief and gratitude, a legacy of friendship in the years that followed. The Dutch never forgot. Canadian war cemeteries such as Grosbeek and Holton became sacred ground, meticulously maintained by Dutch volunteers. Each year, on May 4th and 5th, the Netherlands holds Remembrance and Liberation Days, honoring the soldiers who freed them. Princess Juliana of the Netherlands, who had taken refuge in Canada during the war, expressed her country's eternal gratitude. Her daughter, Princess Margriet, had been born in Ottawa in 1943 to ensure her Dutch citizenship. The Canadian government declared her hospital room extraterritorial Dutch soil, a unique gesture of friendship. After the war, the Netherlands began sending 100,000 tulip bulbs each year to Canada in thanks. From that gift grew Ottawa's Canadian Tulip Festival, which still celebrates the bond between the two nations today. Coming home for the soldiers. Victory brought both relief and sorrow. They had survived, but thousands of comrades had not. When the news of the ceasefire spread, men wept openly in the streets. The relief was overwhelming, remembered Sergeant Stuart Johns of the Canadian Grenadier Guards. Yet it was mixed with grief for those who didn't live to see it. The Canadians stayed in the Netherlands for months after the surrender, helping restore order, distribute food, and care for the sick. They were not conquerors, but guardians. Dutch families invited soldiers into their homes. Friendships and romances blossomed. More than 4,000 Dutch women would eventually marry Canadian servicemen and immigrate to Canada as war brides. When the troops finally sailed home in late 1945, they were greeted as heroes, yet many carried invisible scars. The horrors of Ortona, Normandy, and the Scheldt left lasting wounds. Some veterans struggled for years with what would now be called post-traumatic stress. Others returned to quiet lives, channeling their discipline into building communities and families. One of them was Company Sergeant Major Charles Martin, the man who had led his company onto Juno Beach. He came home to Cooksville, Ontario, where he worked for the Ontario Department of Agriculture and ran a small general store with his wife. He served as a school trustee and community volunteer, never boasting, never forgetting. For the 50th anniversary of D-Day in 1994, he wrote his memoir, Battle Diary, capturing the voices of ordinary Canadian soldiers who had fought through extraordinary times. He died in October 1997, honored by a memorial trail and plaque in his hometown, a tribute to a man who embodied the courage of a nation. When the guns of Europe finally fell silent in May 1945, the world began to take stock of the cost and meaning of victory. For the Canadian Army, that reckoning was both triumph and tragedy. From the rocky beaches of Dieppe to the muddy estuaries of the from the ruins of Caen to the liberated towns of the Netherlands, Canadians had fought with courage, ingenuity, and unyielding determination. They had begun the war as an inexperienced militia and ended it as one of the most effective fighting forces in the Allied camp. More than 1 million Canadians had served in uniform out of a population of only 11 million. Of these, 42,000 died and 60,000 were wounded. Nearly 23,000 of the dead were soldiers. For a nation that had entered the war reluctantly, without a large standing army, those numbers represented extraordinary sacrifice. Yet, beyond the statistics, the true measure of Canadian achievement lay in the quality of its soldiers, their adaptability, leadership, and quiet professionalism. From inexperience to mastery. When Canada declared war on Germany in September 1939, its army numbered fewer than 5,000 regular soldiers. The country's military infrastructure was minimal, outdated equipment, few armored vehicles, and limited experience among officers. Training camps were improvised, uniforms were patched together, and weapons were borrowed from Britain. What Canada possessed, however, was willpower and organization. From 1939 to 1945, Canada transformed itself into a modern war machine. Training depots expanded across the country. New factories produced tanks, trucks, and munitions in staggering quantities. Volunteers poured into recruitment centers from every province. By 1942, Canada was sending entire divisions overseas, trained, equipped, and ready for battle. The evolution from a militia force to a professional army was one of the most remarkable national mobilizations of the Second World War. The disaster at Dieppe in 1942 became the crucible of change. Though tragic, the raid exposed every weakness in planning, leadership, and coordination. The lessons learned, the need for better combined arms tactics, intelligence gathering, and inter-service cooperation became the foundation for Canada's later victories. The army that stormed Juno Beach 2 years later was not the same force that had died on the beaches of Dieppe. It was seasoned, confident, and unified. Leadership and innovation. Key to that transformation was leadership. Early in the war, commanders like Major General Andrew McNaughton had focused on maintaining Canadian independence within the Allied structure, ensuring that Canadian forces would fight together as a national unit rather than be dispersed under British command. While that policy preserved Canadian identity, it also delayed combat deployment. The shift came when field leaders like General Harry Crerar and Lieutenant General Guy Simons took command. Methodical and cautious, ensured that the 1st Canadian Army maintained professionalism and logistical efficiency. Simons, brilliant and daring, became the Army's tactical innovator. His night armored assault during Operation Totalize in Normandy was one of the most original operations of the war. It combined radio beacons, pathfinder tanks, and tracer guidance systems to coordinate movement in darkness, a feat no other army had attempted on such a scale. His methods influenced armored doctrine for decades. After 1945, Canadian engineers, too, were at the forefront of innovation. Their rapid construction of Bailey bridges, floating pontoons, and temporary causeways across rivers and canals became legendary. From the flooded fields of the Scheldt to the Rhine crossing during Operation Plunder, their ingenuity allowed Allied advances that might otherwise have stalled. Canadian infantry units pioneered new urban combat techniques. The mouse-holing method, blasting through internal walls to move between buildings without exposing soldiers to open streets, was first used out of necessity at Ortona in Italy and perfected in Normandy. Decades later, it would become standard practice in urban warfare training worldwide. These innovations did not emerge from theory but from the brutal realities of combat. Lacking the vast manpower of the United States or the industrial empire of Britain, the Canadians compensated with creativity and precision. They learned quickly, adapted constantly, and relied on cooperation between infantry, armor, and engineers. Every soldier understood that flexibility could mean the difference between victory and annihilation. Courage and the Canadian soldier. The war produced countless examples of individual valor. 3 Canadians earned the Victoria Cross, the British Commonwealth's highest award for gallantry. Captain Paul Triquet, of the Royal 22E Regiment, Vendôme, received it for his heroism at Casa Berardi in Italy. On December 14, 1943, when his company was reduced to 14 men, under relentless German fire, Triquet personally led the survivors forward, captured the objective, and held it for 24 hours against counterattacks. Private Ernest "Smoky" Smith, of the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada, earned his Victoria Cross near the Savio River in October 1944. Armed with a PIAT anti-tank launcher, Smith single-handedly destroyed a German Panther tank, drove off another, and neutralized multiple machine gun nests, saving his section from annihilation. Major John Mahoney, of the Westminster Regiment, was honored for his actions at the Melfa River in May 1944, when he led his company across a heavily defended crossing, held it for 6 hours under intense fire, and repelled repeated German counterattacks. Despite being wounded twice, each of these men became a symbol of the larger spirit of the Canadian Army, ordinary individuals performing extraordinary feats out of duty and loyalty to their comrades. But for every decorated hero, there were hundreds of soldiers whose courage went unrecorded. Riflemen holding a trench in the rain, engineers repairing bridges under fire, medics dragging the wounded from burning tanks, Together, they built Canada's reputation on the battlefields of Europe, fighting prejudice and CPO perception. Despite these accomplishments, Canadian forces faced skepticism and condescension throughout much of the war. Within the Allied hierarchy, they were often treated as second-tier troops, brave, yes, but colonials lacking the sophistication of the British or the might of the Americans. That prejudice had deep roots. Canada had not fought a major war since 1918, and between the wars its army had nearly vanished. When the Second World War began, few outside Canada believed it could field a capable fighting force. The failure at Dieppe only reinforced those assumptions. Yet, when tested, the Canadians consistently outperformed expectations. On D-Day, they advanced farther inland than any other Allied division. At Ortona, they fought German paratroopers to a standstill in one of the fiercest urban battles of the Western Front. At Falaise, they helped encircle and destroy Germany's best remaining army in France. At the Scheldt, they succeeded where others might have refused to try. Still, post-war histories written by American and British authors often marginalized these achievements. Popular accounts celebrated Omaha Beach, Market Garden, and the Bulge, while Canadian operations were relegated to footnotes. This imbalance shaped public memory for decades. Only in recent years have historians begun to restore Canada's rightful place in the narrative of Allied victory. The historians and the historian John Keegan recognized Canada's exceptional record, noting that on D-Day the Third Canadian Infantry Division advanced farther and faster than any other Allied force. Canadian scholars such as Terry Kopp and Mark Zulk have since expanded on this legacy, documenting the meticulous coordination, tactical innovation, and human endurance that defined Canadian operations. Their research reveals that Canada's victories were not accidents of geography or luck, but the result of methodical training, disciplined leadership, and an ethos of perseverance. As historian Kopp observed, Canadian soldiers were not better armed or more numerous. They were simply better prepared, and they refused to quit. The price of victory, the cost of that perseverance, was immense. Over 22,900 Canadian soldiers were killed in ground combat during the war. Every province, every town, every village contributed sons who never returned. Small communities in Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia lost entire generations of young men. The pain of those losses rippled through the nation long after the parades ended. Veterans returning home carried not just medals but memories of horror. They had seen comrades buried under rubble, civilians starved, and Europe in ruins. Many suffered in silence from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Yet, rather than succumb to despair, many channeled their experiences into building a new Canada, one defined by compassion, civic duty, and peacekeeping. Post-war transformation. In the years after 1945, the Canadian Army played a major role in the reconstruction of Europe. Canadian units participated in occupation duties in Germany and humanitarian efforts in the Netherlands. Their conduct during this period, disciplined, humane, and generous, helped establish Canada's global reputation as a peacekeeping nation, long before that term became common. At home, returning veterans used their leadership skills to rebuild the economy and communities. Men who had once led platoons now led towns, schools, and businesses. The federal government introduced the Veterans Charter, providing education and housing benefits similar to America's GI Bill. Entire suburbs grew around returning servicemen and their families. Canada's wartime unity laid the foundation for its post-war prosperity. The war also reshaped Canada's identity within the Commonwealth. No longer merely Britain's junior partner, Canada had proven its ability to plan and command complex, independent operations. The 1st Canadian Army was not just a symbolic formation. It was a powerful, autonomous force that fought alongside but not beneath the British. That independence would continue to shape Canada's military and diplomatic policies for decades. The enduring Dutch bond of all Canada's wartime legacies, none was more profound than its relationship with the Netherlands. The liberation forged a bond of gratitude that endures to this day. Every spring, Dutch children place flowers on Canadian graves, and cities across the Netherlands host ceremonies honoring their liberators. In Ottawa, the annual Canadian Tulip Festival, born from the Dutch gift of 100,000 tulip bulbs, transforms the capital into a sea of color each May. The tulips bloom as living symbols of remembrance and friendship. For many Dutch families, the Canadian flag remains a cherished emblem of hope. This enduring connection also lives through personal stories. Thousands of Dutch war brides immigrated to Canada after the war, marrying soldiers who had liberated their towns. Their children and grandchildren today bridge two nations with a shared heritage of gratitude and freedom. Montgomery's reluctant praise of the often critical Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, whose early doubts about Canadian capability were well known, eventually acknowledged their excellence. In his post-war reflections, Montgomery described Lieutenant General Guy Simonds as one of the finest corps commanders in the Allied armies. His praise was grudging, but it spoke volumes. Montgomery had once dismissed Canadian troops as inexperienced colonials. By 1945, he recognized them as equals, professional, disciplined, and battle. That transformation, achieved through years of hard fighting, reflected both the evolution of Canada's army and the maturation of Canada itself. Remembering Charles Martin and his generation, among those who embodied that spirit was Company Sergeant Major Charles Martin, who led his men through the surf at Juno Beach. On June 6, 1944, when his landing craft ramp dropped into the gunfire, he was 25 years old, one of the youngest sergeant majors in regimental history. He survived that day and every campaign that followed, returning home to live quietly in Cooksville, Ontario. Decades later, his memoir Battle Diary captured not only the terror and chaos of war, but also the pride of ordinary soldiers who had proven extraordinary things. He wrote, "We were not heroes when we landed. We were scared men who did our jobs because there was no one else to do them." Martin died in 1997, but his story, and those of his comrades, live on in memorials, history books, and the collective memory of two nations forever linked by sacrifice. Epilogue. The forgotten victory. In the grand narratives of World War II, Canada's story remains too often overshadowed by the giants beside it. Yet, if one measures capability by accomplishment, by objectives achieved, obstacles overcome, and courage displayed, then the Canadian Army's record stands among the finest of the war. At Juno Beach, they advanced farther inland than any other Allied division. At Ortona, they fought Germany's elite paratroopers to a standstill. At Falaise, they closed the gap that ended the Normandy campaign. At the Scheldt, they opened Antwerp, enabling the Allied advance into Germany. At the Rhine, they bridged the last barrier to victory. And in the Netherlands, they not only liberated a nation, but fed its starving people. They did all this not as but as citizens in uniform, men and women who believed that freedom was worth dying for. Today, the tulips in Ottawa bloom each spring, and children in the Netherlands lay flowers on Canadian graves. These gestures speak more eloquently than medals or monuments. They remind us that greatness is not measured by empire or power, but by humanity. On June 6, 1944, when Charles Martin and his men stepped onto Juno Beach, Allied commanders doubted they could succeed. By nightfall they had proven them wrong, not just for a day, but for history. From that moment onward, Canada was no longer a junior partner. It was a nation forged in courage, tested in fire, and defined by honor.